Welcome, everyone. So, my name is Erik Feiring, and I'm Assistant Director in NORAD, where I lead our work on innovation. My job here today is very simple, or very hard, to keep us on time and make sure we finish on time. So, today's topic is digital public infrastructure and digital transformation, and what India has done that we can learn from if Norway, what we have to contribute, and how we can work together to improve the world. We have a guest of honor here today, which I would like to introduce. So, in the public invitation to this event, we described Nandan Nilekani as India's Bill Gates. That's quite frivolous, and to be fair, not accurate. We should perhaps say that Bill Gates is America's Nandan Nilekani. So, let me briefly introduce Nandan. So, Nandan founded Infosys, one of the world's largest IT consulting firms, where he was a CEO for a time, and he is now the non-executive chairman of the company. He is also the architect behind Aadhaar, which is India's biometric ID system, and a key component of the India stack, which Nandan will tell you more about in a minute. But also, he is a visionary philanthropist who has already used a lot of his personal wealth to invest in development assistance projects, other types of social investments, also alongside Norway in several cases. So, Nandan, we're really pleased that you could join us here in Norway and in Arendal. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Eric, and I'm very grateful to NORAD for inviting me here. I had not heard of Arendalsuka, but I think it's a phenomenal event, and I hope you'll let me come more often. So today I'll speak about India's digital transformation. I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but give you a flavor of what's been happening and why it's so strategic, not only for India, but for the world and for Norway. We know the world is getting hotter, it's getting older, but we also know that India is a young country in an aging world which has huge potential. It's democratic, and for once, all the stars are aligned. It's growing well. It's creating jobs, and it's expected to be among the top 3 economies in the world in the next 30 to 40 years. But if you actually go inside, it's not one homogeneous country. It's not one country which speaks one language. It's a country which speaks more than 200, 300 languages. There are 22 official languages. If 2 Indians meet, it's unlikely they even talk in the same language. It's actually not one market. There are many markets across, and for many years, every state was a different market, different tax system. The levels of industrializations are different. Many states are very advanced. Some states are not so advanced. And of course, it has a whole gamut of regulations and so on. Now, the question is, how do you take these loosely connected microeconomies and create one large one? And that's exactly the journey that India is on. And essentially, it's a journey where a country which has been offline, informal, low productivity microeconomies is becoming a single market and a macroeconomy. And that's part of the reason why it's growing so fast and will continue to do well. But what is the reason for this? Because of the fact that we have used a new way of doing things, which we call as digital public infrastructure. In other words, this is a technology enabled or built by the state, which will actually accelerate innovation, accelerate competition and markets, but by enabling the state to do many things. Now, this is not a new idea. If you look at the original internet was digital public infrastructure. It was built by the US government. It was built with standard protocols, SMTP, HTTP, and so on. And then you had private innovation on top. The same thing with GPS. GPS was built by the US government, which answered the question, where am I? And today, everyone using a map or calling a ride-hailing company is using that infrastructure. So the notion of digital public infrastructure is not new. But what we have done in India is extended this to newer and newer areas. And each of them is a simple building block. It does one thing well, but does it at the scale of 1 billion people. In other words, you take a single activity at 1 billion people, and you make sure that all these building blocks can then talk to each other. So that's the whole idea. For example, the Aadhaar is the digital ID. Eric mentioned that. I worked in the government for 5 years and built this platform. And in the 5 years or 4.5 years I was there, we went from 0 to 600 million digital IDs. We built a system that could enroll 1.5 million people a day. And it was a massively complex technology, but managing the politics was more difficult than the technology. And along with the ID, we have a KYC, which allows you to open a bank account or get a mobile connection instantly. And that led to two massive inclusions. One was on the banking side. The Prime Minister Modi launched the Jandan Yojana program, and 700 million people got bank accounts. And India's financial inclusion really took off. And similarly, on the mobile side, thanks to the private entrepreneurs like Jio, we had a massive increase in networks, huge increase in smartphones, and among the lowest data prices in the world. And when Jio was launched in 2016, our data consumption went from half a gig a month to half a gig a day, a 30x increase So essentially, the idea being everybody has a digital ID that they can use anywhere. Everybody has a bank account where they can receive money or send money, and everybody has a mobile phone to communicate. Now, assume if you can extend that to everyone, what is the impact on development? For example, in 2008, we were the world's most unbanked country. By 2019, in 9 years, we accomplished what would have normally taken without this DPI, would have taken 47 years. So technology was able to accelerate social and financial inclusion, including women. In fact, now there's gender parity in India's bank accounts. So whereas earlier it was very much skewed against women, so it also helps in addressing gender concerns. And what we have learned from DPI is that DPI creates data as a byproduct. Now we know that when we use any application on the internet or an app on our phones, we know that we generate data about our behavior, about our usage. But historically, in this last 20 years, this data is either used by companies, and they send you ads and whatnot, or governments to keep tabs on you. But the real value of data from a development perspective is, can we make that data accessible and available to every person? In other words, can we empower people with their own data? So you require a whole different architecture, where instead of data getting consolidated, it gets to each person and they can use that. And we call that digital capital. So just like we had earlier forms of capital, land, financial assets and so on, now we have a new kind of capital, which is digital capital. And the good thing about digital capital is whether you're in Norway, in Oslo using a smartphone, or in Bihar using a smartphone, your digital capital actually is the same because you both generate the same transactions. And therefore, if we can find a way to harness this for your benefit, then we can have huge social benefits. And therefore, we believe this actually lays the foundation for what we call as the new grand bargain of formalization. Now, one of the biggest challenges across the world in societies is how do we make economies more formal? How do we make it more inclusive? How do we bring them into the system? How do we make sure that they get the benefits and fruits of the system? And many societies are actually not able to deal with this because you have a small elite which has everything going for them, and you have a large number of people outside the system. And that leads to political consequences, polarization, and so on. And therefore, you have to create an inclusive model of getting them into the system. But historically, we have not been able to do that because there's been no incentive for a person in the informal economy to join the formal economy. First of all, it's very difficult to join. And then you only get into the net of bureaucracy and taxes and so on. So we believe that with digital capital, you actually solve this problem. Number one, you have made it simpler for people to join the system. Easy to get an ID, easy to get a bank account, easy to get a mobile connection, easy to get a loan. Suddenly, made it easier. And also, you now get, thanks to joining the formal system, you get things you couldn't get in the informal system. So in the informal system, you depended on high rate interest loans from money lenders. Now in the formal system, using your own data as collateral, you can get access to a much more affordable loan. And therefore, there's an incentive to join the system. So this essentially has created the infrastructure for formalization, which is a pressing concern around the world. We also believe that DPIs can balance the tension between innovation and regulation. So what we have seen in the world is either you have untrammeled innovation and then you end up with a lot of monopolies and so on, and then you spend all your time trying to figure out how to take care of that. Or you have a lot of regulations, but nothing actually gets done because there's no innovation. So how do you strike the balance in this fast-changing world between innovation and regulation? And we think using the digital public infrastructure approach actually gets this balance. Now, it's not just about good to have. These things have actually proved their value even when there's a crisis. For example, during the pandemic, many Indians who had jobs in cities went back to their villages because of the pandemic, and they didn't have any source of income. So the government decided to transfer money into their bank accounts. So a total of $4.5 billion was transferred into 160 million beneficiary accounts in a matter of days. The reason you could do that is you had the plumbing. Everybody had a digital ID, everybody had a bank account. You could just press a button and the money would go in straight through processing into accounts. And across the country, you had business correspondents from whom you could withdraw money. So the whole infrastructure enabled you to deal with the crisis very effectively. Similarly, India was able to vaccinate make 2 billion vaccinations in 2 years because there's a digital platform for vaccination. You could get vaccinated anywhere, 1 dose here, 1 dose there. Everybody got an instant digital certificate and so on. So what it shows is that this is not just nice to have. These are actually fundamental capabilities that allow you to be agile enough to deal with challenges of crisis and so on. And we believe the same model of DPIs will also handle the upcoming crises. For example, in climate, one of the challenges we're going to have in adaptation is how do we make sure people are able to deal with some crisis that may come. Like if you're living near the sea, you want to make the houses more robust because of rising water. If you're living in areas that are flood prone, you have to make sure the foundation is sound. So there's a whole amount of adaptation-led anticipatory financing that we expect around the world. But to do that, you need the plumbing. You need the way to reach the money to the right person at the right time with the right amount. Or you want to create a circular economy. You want to make sure that there's no waste created and everything goes back. And we have things like ONDC, which allow you to connect all this into a circular economy. Or you want to change the whole model of energy. You want to go from monolithic big power plants to millions of small producers, everyone using the battery in the day and putting in energy back in the network. But how do you create this interoperability? You need digital public infrastructure. So even for the upcoming challenges of the world like climate, we need to think about how to create infrastructure at population scale, which is open and inclusive, which allows everyone to participate, and it's not necessarily just with a couple of companies. And so we think that this is also required for the challenges of the future. The reason why this happened in India was that we had a very strong IT services industry. It's a $250 billion industry which employs 5 million people. So the talent was there to build this. And we have an amazing startup system. Just to give you a sense of the scale of India's startup system, we had 1,000 startups in 2016, and today we have over 100,000 startups. So in other words, in the space of 7 years, it's massive explosion. So a combination of the technology, talent density, density of startups, and digital infrastructure has enabled the transformation that you see today. So think of it as a new model of growth. And today we're talking about SDGs and how to get to SDGs by 2030. You need digital infrastructure thought through well to actually accelerate reaching the SDGs. And we think that this is much more collaborative, much more equitable, much more inclusive, and actually makes opportunity at scale to everyone. And the proof is it's not theory, it's actually happening on the ground. So this is a working system. So I think, as your Prime Minister has said, this digital technology makes the difference for transformation. The IMF has recognized the digital infrastructure, which we call India Stack. And now we have a global coalition of Norway, World Bank, MOSIP, which is ID platform, Co-Develop, which is a philanthropy, etc., Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is out here. Basically, it is a global coalition to take this notion of digital public infrastructure at scale to 50 countries in 5 years and lay the foundation for transforming these countries in a way which is faster, more effective, more inclusive, and well aligned with SDG goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nandan. I mean, when I talk about digitalization, I say it's cross-sectoral. It's something that can then have a positive impact on all sectors at once if you make the right investments. But what you do, Nandan, is you really make it alive for us and show us the live, full-scale examples from India for how it has impacted on financial inclusion, gender equality, entrepreneurship, and economic growth. So thank you so much for showing us that vivid picture. We are now moving into a panel debate, and we have Liv Dingsør to lead and moderate the discussion. Liv is CEO of Digital Norway, which is a non-profit organization working for improved public-private collaboration to make Norway a more digitized society. So Liv, I'm handing it over to you to introduce the other panelists and to lead the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you again, Nandan, for such an inspiring talk. I'm not only speaking on behalf of myself on that one. To see this huge country going from this offline, informal, like you said, low productivity, microeconomics, to this single formal high productivity mega economy with the basis of it all, a new approach to solving societal problems, the digital public infrastructure. It's interesting to see how this DPI, thank you very much, can balance this tension between innovation and regulation, and also help on climate crisis and social inclusion. So it's a good thing then that the topic for the panel discussion today is how India and Norway can indeed change the world, for the better, I might say, through digitalization. So let's go. Get up on stage. You have already been introduced to Nandan Nilekani. Take your seat. Joining him on stage, Morten Dalsmo, Executive Vice President, Sintef Digital, and Bård Vegar Solhed, Director General in Norad. And while you... I'm going to give you these. There you go. And while you catch your breath, Nandan, I'm going to start with you, Bård Vegar. To get right to it, what do you think we can learn from India, and how can we make these lessons from India relevant for developing countries that you work with?
So what's not to learn? It's always what I feel whenever I heard Nandan speaking or working with the Indian example. But let me just start somewhere else, which is, so Norad's mandate is of course to create as much development in the global south as possible with a limited amount of resources. That's what global development is about. And that is also the reason why we, 5 years ago or so, started working with digital public infrastructure, and specifically with India and Nandan and his team. Because digitalization and digital public infrastructure specifically has the potential to transform countries, and it's one of the most effective investments we can do in development. I think when you do development, you build a school, a road, a hospital, invest in something, you do it school by school, investment by investment. So the most efficient and good digital investments, you invest in an infrastructure which can also be shared, that can be used again and again, country by country. So it's an immensely good way of creating development. And Nandan has just explained what it means. Just imagine digital ID. So close to 1 billion people, around 850, 900 people globally, they don't have an ID. It's not that the card isn't working. It's they have no identity. And then without an identity, you can't receive a cash payment, you can't enter into the economy, use all the public services in the country and so on. I was just in Somalia, one of the poorest countries in the world. There, the World Bank we're supporting is handing out cash payments in the humanitarian crisis, and because they are also building digital infrastructure under it, it's much more efficient, they're able to reach much more people. So it's a no-brainer in a way to invest in these things, and we are now co-hosting the Digital Public Goods Alliance with UNICEF. We've been able to engage more partners, but I think without India, we wouldn't be able to do it because they've come so far, but also because it's much more efficient to see the Indian example, a country where there's still a lot of extreme poverty, and what you've been able to do than Norwegians coming to tell that. Yeah, so that's simply why we've been invested into it.
Yes. So this system has obviously leapfrogged India digitally. We like to think that we are way ahead in Norway, but what can Norway learn from India's experience, Morten? And are there any lessons from Norway to share?
Lots of lessons to learn from this, and I'm really starstruck. I mean, this is really impressive, and I strongly believe in digitalization as a tool to solve the big challenges that we are trying to solve these days, and the SDGs, of course, part of that definitely. And in SINTEF, we have this vision about technology for a better society and SDGs that are governing our strategy. And to me, this is a brilliant example of what you can achieve. And it's really impressive because it's the speed, it's the time, and it's the scale that is really impressive. And I really believe you that it's possible to roll this out in 50 countries in 5 years. And let's see how we can work together to make this happen, because this is really, really good stuff. And there is a lot of things to learn, from this. But first of all, I think we have some competence in Norway. We have some experience in Norway that can be valuable in this cooperation. But first of all, I think we need to understand how difficult it is to do this in such short time, such a scale. It's just impressive.
It is impressive. And Nandan, you have said that digital public infrastructure requires deep conviction, not deep pockets. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think when you look at some of the challenges in the world today, the climate transition is going to cost us trillions of dollars every year. Solving the global debt problem is going to cost us another trillion or two. So these are massive requirements of money. In the case of DPI, the scale is an order of magnitude lower. I mean, maybe 50, 100 billion to fix the whole world's digital infrastructure. And that will have a huge multiplier effect, because that is like a horizontal transformation capability which can be used for health, for education, for SDGs, you know what. So it's not a money problem. I mean, it's a money problem, sure, but not a money problem on the scale of climate transition. Right? But it requires conviction that you do this, and that means political leaders and senior people in countries have to believe that doing this will make sense. Because if you don't do it with a strategic vision of what has to be done, if you do it very tactically and go from project to project in silos, then you won't get the full value for this. So I think having that deep conviction is important. And I must say that, in the last couple of years, there's a huge interest across the world. MOSIP, which NORAD has supported, has built an open source ID system being rolled out in 9 countries, including in the Philippines, Morocco, Ethiopia. Yeah. The vaccination certificate built in India has been rolled out in 6 countries. So now I think there's enough experience that you can take these digital public infrastructure, and if they're packaged as open source solutions that are free to use, then countries can take them. And there's a whole ecosystem of players coming in to help countries implement them. But it requires the political will and belief at the highest level that this is a way to go forward. So I think that's what we mean by deep conviction and not deep pockets. It needs deep pockets, but not climate scale deep pockets.
Yeah. And you also said that, to me, the most impressive thing is the doing here. It's being done. And you say it takes a lot of good helpers on that. And of course, when we talk about digital public infrastructure, we understand it is kind of clear that the governments are key to implement. But what is the role of the private sector? And you have mentioned the competitive market economy on top of DPI, and I noted the word incentive design also earlier. How important is the incentive design element here to unleash the power of all these?
Yeah, I think incentives are very important, and we have to make sure that there are enough people who have an incentive to use the system, and people who have a disincentive to use the system should not come in the way of it happening. So you have to handle both sides of that. And I think, and innovation is very important. We are not saying these are government systems. these are enabled by government, just like the internet was enabled by government, but architected in a way that innovators can build on top of that. So really it's about striking the balance between government and regulation and innovation, but also consciously coming up with an architecture which creates a competitive digital economy. Because the nature of digital economy, if you don't have the right set of guardrails, can lead to winner-take-all models, monopolies, and so on. So this actually encourages competition among all the players, so that the citizen or the consumer gets everything they should get, but in a very competitive, innovative economy where new players can come in and so on.
What is the most challenging and also the most inspiring handling this multitude of stakeholders that you have been dealing with for the last years to make this happen?
Well, how do you navigate through all this? Right? It's not easy to figure out that. I'm sure you know the issues. So I think that's very challenging. But my own experience has been that if there's a sufficiently bold and audacious goal, and if the different stakeholders, for different reasons, we're able to convince them about the benefits of that goal, then we can align people of different political backgrounds or different interests to come together. And of course, the biggest payoff is that you see it working, right? If I walk down the street and I see a vegetable seller taking digital payments for selling 10 rupees worth of vegetables, then I know that we have changed our life.
Yes.
So I think that's a satisfaction you get.
We are talking a lot about public-private cooperation in Norway and EU also, Morten. What is your take on this?
I think that is really important to succeed, and of course in Norway we have one thing that is very important, and that is trust, and that is something that we really use in any case to foster this collaboration between private and public sector. And we have some success also in Norway when it comes to digital infrastructure, but not in the same scale as India, because it's bits and pieces. I think what you have seen here is the total system that has been transformed. And that is important, and I think that is because you have been able to create that political momentum to make this happen. Because in Norway we are extremely good at making strategies, but we are not as good at implementing the strategies. So that I think here you see you make a strategy and you make it happen, and that is very important, and that is something that we should learn. Not just talk about it and agree that this is a really good strategy, but actually do it. Because this is what happens here. And I think when it comes to EU, the same goes for EU. A lot of the research and innovation activities they have a strong belief in making this public-private partnership a success. So that is important in any projects that we attend, that we have this public-private partnership as part of that.
How important is that for NORAD with all collaboration across these stakeholders?
It's totally important, and the work we are doing here is a public-private partnership and cooperation. Really, we are a government. The country is, of course, implementing our governments. MUSIP, our partner, and other partners are foundations. There are philanthropists financing, and there are private companies building services on top of it. So in a way, it is a partnership between public and private. I think maybe it's also important to understand that what we call digital public infrastructure is more visible also in our own country and globally than we think about. So we use these kinds of services every day in Norway, from weather services to ID services, right? So they're here. There's also one very interesting Norwegian example of a global public infrastructure that has become important, which is the health system GHIS2, which was developed at the University of Oslo. It's a health system that is used by, I think, more than 50 countries around the world. And just one example of how efficient it is, because Sri Lanka has that health system. When COVID hit us, they used it to develop a COVID registration tool on top of that. But since it was open source, right, other countries could adapt their systems and use that. So in a very short time, countries with more than half of the population of the world were using that system, which would have taken a long time if it wasn't an open source digital public infrastructure. So all these kinds of examples are important for us, and it's the reason why it's so essential in global development.
And talking about digitalization these days, we cannot not mention artificial intelligence. And these terms are somewhat, or sometimes I think, conflated as if the use of AI and digitalization is the same thing. So Nandan, do you think being a digitalization, terrible word, digitalization leader and AI leader the same?
Well, not really. I mean, obviously AI is a new and both powerful and potentially worrying development of technology. But talking about AI is like talking about the penthouse without the house being built. It's really, I think, the foundation of the building is digital technology, making sure it's inclusive, that the data is well organized. And then you can always have an AI layer on top of that, which uses the data and solves problems. So I think certainly it's there, but I don't think we should realize that to do AI, we need other things to be in place.
Yeah. What is your take on that?
I totally agree. And to do AI, you need data. And in order to get data, you need a strong and good foundation, and that is a digital infrastructure. So no AI without a digital infrastructure. So that goes without saying. But it's important to remember that, because when we talk about AI, we often tend to forget that. And when it comes to AI, I think it's both promising and worrying. A lot of things that we can do with AI. But one thing that we see is that digital technologies they have the potential to cut global emissions by 20% by 2030, and AI is quite fundamental in that. So there is a strong potential in using all the data that the digital infrastructure create to actually solve some of the big challenges that we are trying to solve, and AI can be part of that together with other digital technologies. And that is what we call the twin transition, and I think that is an area where we could collaborate even more with Norway, India. We have strong competence in our domains, energy sector, maritime sector, some of the sectors that we share with India, and I think that could also be very interesting to see how we could collaborate in the twin transition to solve the SDGs.
Sure.
So data is the fuel to all of this, and it would be interesting to hear from you, Nandan. To me, it seems, or it doesn't seem, it is difficult in Norway to share data across the different public sector players for some reason in this small country. How did you manage this in India? How did you work to actually get this data flow that are necessary to create this value on top?
I think, first of all, not having technology is an asset. Not having legacy systems which have developed over 40 years, because trying to fix that means you tread on somebody's toes. But if you have a completely greenfield situation where there's no technology, so when we began the ID system, there was many people didn't have IDs, hundreds of millions of people, because they didn't have birth certificates. So we could straight away go to a modern, online, cloud-based digital ID, so you could leapfrog everything else. Or if you look at a mobile network, we hardly had landlines, but now we have mobiles everywhere. So in some sense, when you take to technology later in the cycle, you can actually leapfrog. Similarly, for payments, we didn't have any digital payments to note, and that's why we could go straight away to 9.6 billion transactions a month, 350 million people using, because they could straight away use it. So I think, in some sense, if you have a legacy of systems, it's more difficult. Specifically on data, I think that's why a lot of the thought that goes into DPI is how do we unlock the data for the person? And that's the fundamental challenge, right? If the data is inside a system which belongs to a company or a government, then they are very reluctant to share it. But it's your data, and therefore, if you have a way of getting your data, and then you can assemble whatever you want out of the data and get value, then you flip the whole empowerment to the people. So data empowerment and all that is strategic for a real democratic use of technology.
Data empowerment to the people, that is something that we can really take back to Norway. In the panel and in the audience here today, I'm looking at some of you here. I see that we have Norwegian policymakers, we have decision makers, we have key stakeholders on digitalization, and the ambition to scale this model, I hear, to 50 countries in the next 5 years. Yeah. So what will you recommend Norway to do to accelerate this digital transformation in other parts of the world?
Well, I think
What is your
Norway is
advice?
very, very critical to this. Norway already has a strong digital sector as we see today. Norway has a huge commitment to global development with organizations like NORAD. And I think this, taking it to 50 countries in 5 years requires a global coalition. It can't be done by one entity, one country. It has to be many countries, many global multilateral agencies, technologists, businesses, non-profits. They all have to come together. So I think this 15.5 is a rallying cry, saying here's this technology. It's available to everyone. It's open source. It's free. There are no strings attached. You're not getting locked in. And if we all work together, we can actually reach 50 countries in 5 years and make a material difference to the development of the world. So I think that brings all of us together, and I think Norway is going to be a very, very critical actor in this.
So, Morten, what will SINTEF as a research institute do to accelerate this agenda?
We would certainly like to contribute, and we have actually...
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. we would certainly like to contribute, and I'm really enthusiastic about this idea. And I would say that we have just initiated a strategic project on global sustainable development. So this fits really well into that strategy. So we would really like to participate, contribute in this together with other partners.
We're going to end this panel discussion with you, Bård Vegar, Director General in NORAD. What will you and NORAD do to actually also accelerate this agenda? And with that, you can also do the concluding remarks here.
Yeah, so I remember we were having lunch in Bangalore, and you were like, casually saying, "So, Bård, why don't we do 50 countries in 5 years?" And, being a Norwegian civil service, maybe I should check with the minister at least. You thought I was a bit slow, I remember also. But it's an amazing ambition, but it's a level of ambition that fits what's possible to do with digital transformation, I think. And there are now quite a few key stakeholders. I mean, huge philanthropists like the Gates Foundation is, of course, essential to this. UN agencies like UNICEF, UNDP, others are now on board. Countries like Norway, Germany, Estonia, the US, others are part of it. It was a big event during UNGA last year with really high-level participation, amongst others, Norwegian prime ministers. So we've been taking a leading position, but with others, and impossible to do it, of course, without India. So we want to, from NORAD side, we think, from a technical perspective, this is one of the most cost-efficient investments we can do. It's one of the things that can really transform countries, create development. We want to do more of this with others. Just to end with a quote, I was in Bangalore at a seminar there, and there's one sentence actually that I've been using after that, and I don't know if it's from your presentation, Tanush, or someone else, but it said, "Be the change that inspires change at scale." And I like that because it's a lot about scale when you work with global development. How can you really do the things that matters to lots of people? And that's what we want to contribute to from NORAD's side.
That's a great ending to this panel, I think. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here today, and thank you to the panel.